Okay, so hello everybody. Welcome to this panel on pesticide regulation and health and environmental challenges. So my name is Jean-Noël Jouzel. I'm gonna just shortly present myself. I'm gonna chair this session. I'm a sociologist. I'm a researcher at the CNRS, the French National Research Center, at the Center for the Study of Organization at Sciences Po Paris. And I've been working for a while on the controversies about occupational diseases related to pesticide and their effects on farmers and farm workers. And I'm mostly interested in how science is produced on this topic and how science is incorporated into public policies devoted to risk assessment or risk management of pesticide, or how it is incorporated into workers' compensation schemes, and also how science is being used by social movements which denounce pesticides as dangerous toxicants for farmers or their environment. So this session mostly revolves about the specific issue of how epidemiological data on pesticide exposure and human health is incorporated into regulatory risk assessment. And so maybe I'm just gonna provide you with just some very basic information about the context, and then I leave the floor to the speakers. So as you may know, there has been a lot of epidemiological data which has been produced on pesticides and human health since the end of the 20th century, so since the 1980s and 1990s. So very broadly speaking, this literature has helped a lot figuring out what the dangers of being exposed to pesticides at the workplace or in the general environment may be. And it has helped to understand that at least occupational exposure to pesticide is a risk factor for various chronic diseases, from blood cancers, prostate cancers, to neurodegenerative disorders such as Parkinson's disease. But yet the issue of how to incorporate this data into pesticide risk assessment remains pretty contentious, for most of risk assessment procedures still rely not on epidemiological data but mostly on toxicological data produced on laboratory mice and rats. So our three guests will give us their views on this very complex relationship between science and public policies in the field of human health issues related to pesticides. So let me introduce them. Our first speaker is Evangelia Ntzani. I hope I pronounced correctly. She's an assistant professor of epidemiology in the Department of Hygiene and Epidemiology at the University of Ioannina in Greece, and she's also affiliated to Brown School of Public Health. And she has participated in 2013 in a literature review asked by the EFSA, so the European Food Safety Authority, which is in charge of pesticide regulation in the European Union. Literature review, which topic is very close to the one of this session because it was on the epidemiological studies linking exposure to pesticides and health effects. So I leave the floor to Evangelia first for a 20-minute presentation. After that, we're going to have a short time of questions. Then the next speaker will talk, and at the end of the session, we'll try to have a more general discussion. So Evangelia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jean-Noël. Thank you, everyone, and I'm very happy to be here today. It is a pleasure and honor to be joining this panel. So together, in the next 15 to 20 minutes, we are going to discuss the various challenges that arise from the attempt to incorporate the epidemiological evidence into risk assessment, and we'll provide you my thoughts on, after having done a systematic review on the available published evidence on epi-studies for pesticide exposure, which includes 1,200 studies in the field. So just to follow on the thought that Jean-Noël mentioned before, we've come so far really. The progress that has been made in the field is really astonishing into identifying the risks, putting forward policy changes, and of course we have a long way ahead. So for historical reasons, we always have to acknowledge the progress and achievements that have been made so far relating pesticide exposure and human health. So, from the European perspective and the European Food Safety Authority's perspective, the epidemiological studies based on the available work that has been done so far are an important part in the risk assessment. They are not there to replace any part of the process. They are actually there to support and augment the validity of the process. So it is not always, in the beginning we always had this dilemma between epi studies or epidemiological studies or non-epidemiological studies. I think the true, the present comes to another dilemma, which is how exactly we need to integrate the epi data into the risk assessment. So from the European perspective, we know that we have some robust associations so far. The most famous ones, just as Jean-Noël mentioned, are Parkinson's disease and childhood leukemia, acute leukemia mainly. And these associations there has been an attempt to link these associations with the biological plausibility background and provide an adverse outcome pathway framework which could explain them and provide feedback for the hazard identification and the risk characterization process along the way. A lot of activities need to be done in order to be able to address this. And what is important to understand, and this is why this is put here, is that all stakeholder groups need to be included. But if we step back a little bit and try to see what are the challenges of the epidemiological studies before linking them to a biological plausibility framework and finally arriving in a valid risk assessment process, is that we need to acknowledge and understand their strengths and weaknesses and limitations. So the strengths, they are the real life exposure. We have data that we know we do not address them, we do not intervene as we do in interventional studies, but we can follow the real life exposure of the population. We have different chemicals that can be assessed, not only different pesticides, but other contaminants as well. We have diverse pathways that can be introduced here. And of course, we can address low doses, which is a major issue of discussion for the European Union. Finally, we can include the whole lifespan, which is also important, and we don't need to do any cross-species extrapolation. But if we come to the weaknesses as well, we can see that in many cases, the study design that has been implemented in this literature is not ideal. So we would like to see studies which have either a prospective or a retrospective aspect, where time is taken into consideration, time between the exposure and the outcome that we assess. Yet we have a vast literature with cross-sectional studies, where the exposure and the outcome are assessed at the same time, which creates problems when we try to move from the association studies to making any causal inference between the exposure and the outcome under study. This is of course inherent to any type of research, but what is prominent here in the epidemiological data for pesticides is the poor exposure assessment. So this is the most prominent limitation of this literature, which is inherent, of course, to many of the design attributes of the studies, but also it is inherent to the reality of the field as it is happening. Again, non-validated health outcomes, this is common in other study designs as well, and failure to control for confounders. This is not actually a failure, but is also a limitation. It is something that can be taken into consideration with indirect approaches. And finally, inadequate statistical analysis and inappropriate reporting are some of the proposed weaknesses of this field, which are also prominent in other study designs as well. But just to make things a bit more complicated, we are discussing about incorporating epidemiological data with all the strengths and limitations in that framework. But what we need to take into account is that the risk assessment could move far further than that. So we can set, when we incorporate epidata into this process, that we can understand that it is important to set a roadmap which would enable the incorporation of other data as well. This is a complicated slide. I don't want you to focus on the very specific attributes and components of that. I just need you to understand that the awareness and surveillance of a health outcome or health in general in the system is very complicated, and only a small part of this process is about the epidata. So there are a lot of data sources which do not always take into consideration today, and more importantly, there are so many disciplines. So we have the basic science, we have epi, we have decision science or sciences, methodologies that should be taken into consideration, and of course engineering, social sciences, and medicine among them. And having said that the exposure assessment is a major limitation in the epidemiological studies literature, again, we need to understand, and I will explain how the current situation is evolving, that we have an array of methodologies on how to capture exposure assessment. And these methodologies are sometimes limited in specific study designs, and of course, there is an aspect of the actual reality. So we have valuable cohort studies where the exposure assessment has been decided the way to proceed with it a long time ago, and sometimes we are not able to change that. So we have direct methods and indirect methods. This is all very common to you. I'm just trying to highlight how we have different ways, and more importantly, what we try to come up with from the exposure assessment is actually the modeling behind it. We would like to be able to describe in detail the exposure pattern of the population in a way that would incorporate multiple exposure variables and of course the aspect of time. So the merging of these methods would be an ideal situation for many of the studies that we are dealing with. So what is actually happening with the exposure assessment in the field? This is a publication coming from the IMPRESS project, which is a collaborative effort to make a better work with exposure assessment in epidemiological studies. And regarding the indirect exposure assessment, and for many years, as we will see, this is the dominating way of performing the exposure assessment in the field. So we have self-reported exposures and job titles, which is very common. And what's interesting, as I mentioned before, this type of exposure assessment is very prominent in case control studies. So for many reasons that we can discuss later on, we have this particular situation where we have studies either with a retrospective effort, and in cohort studies as well, in many cohort studies, we also have a prominent indirect exposure assessment component. What is also interesting is that indirect exposure is usually very common in publications coming from high-income countries, because these countries have the capacity to perform either prospective or retrospective studies, where indirect exposure assessment is the norm. And of course, what is also common is that indirect exposure assessment is most commonly linked to registry data related to the outcome. Again, this is an attribute of high-income countries. So if we go to our, so to say, better way, because we have many validation and calibration challenges there as well, we see that in the currently published literature for pesticides, we have 21% of the studies using a direct exposure assessment approach. So we have biomonitoring in blood and in urine, but as you can see after summing up these two percentages, that we have a lot of biomonitoring happening in tissues and matrices that are not our matrix of choice. So we have a lot of other tissues that can be analyzed and of which we don't know well how the correlation between the exposure assessment and the outcome goes. Another interesting aspect here is that we have a representation of cross-sectional studies which conduct direct exposure assessment. And the reason why is that these cross-sectional studies are most commonly performed in lower middle income countries with higher exposure rates. And why is that? Because these countries do not have the capacity to perform cohort studies. They have a smaller capacity, so to say, to be milder in my expression, to perform these studies. So we are borrowing technical and scientific strength. These countries borrow technical and scientific strength from high income countries so that they can do the studies there, and this is quite important. But these studies cannot be prospective. So there we have to jeopardize, we have to compromise with the study design and accept the data coming from cross-sectional studies. What is also important to keep in mind here, coming from this appraisal of the literature, is that in the last 15 years, there is no change in the trend between indirect and direct methods for the exposure assessment. So despite the fact that we had discussed about this so extensively, it is important that the literature for also logistics, for reasons related to logistics, cannot change this trend. So, but are there any other trends in the literature? So this is a description of the extremes. This is part of a systematic review that we have done for UNEP regarding the exposure of pesticides and its relationship, its association with health-related outcomes. So glyphosate, which is a compound that we have discussed a lot about these previous years, is not something new for the research literature. So researchers, epidemiologists, has been assessing its effects a long time ago, before it became so popular for the media. And then again, the literature has an obsession, has a persistence in addressing very old compounds here. So we have that, we know very well that we still have many studies addressing associations between DDT use in the past. And these associations are prominent in the field. They are there, they're quite frequent, even though sometimes they are used as an internal control for the studies that are conducted. When we try to link these substances to the outcomes, this is what we came up with from the 20,000 associations that had been performed in the large overview that we had conducted for UNEP. So here, these are associations, so a distinct exposure window linking a specific outcome with a compound. So here you can see that this looks like a lot the traditional toxicology field. So all the major outcomes that are related to the epidata are driven from our primary interest in traditional toxicology. So you can see here carcinogenicity, you can see here development, you can see here also neurological related outcomes, and of course the endocrinology related outcomes. So this is a field that is communicating, it is fusing with other parts in many different areas. So if you try to answer a very specific research question out from this this ocean of data, you can say, okay, now this is enough. I would like to focus in one particular outcome, which we know very well, for example, which is leukemia in children. So if you go through this large database of 1,200 studies in the last years, you see that you can identify 52 studies, and you say, okay, it is enough. It's a large systematic review. So this is something that actually includes almost 200,000 participants across 30 countries. So you say, okay, I will be able to say something about it. But if you go through the data and you go again and again, and be reminded that here we began with 300,000 citations to work with. If you go then into the discrete research questions and try to assess whether maternal environmental exposure during pregnancy is related to acute childhood leukemia, you actually end up with 6 studies. So this is another practical issue that becomes very important in the risk assessment process. So there again, we have a statistically significant association, of course, but compared to the pool of data that we have available, again, this is a limited field, a limited database to work with. And why this is happening? And what are the challenges out there? So for the quality assessment of these studies, and this is also data coming from the adult populations, and where you see the darker bars, this is a high risk of bias, and as the bar becomes lighter, fader, we have a lower risk of bias. We understand that it is not only the exposure assessment that actually creates challenges for the process. So we also have a problem with the source of the cases. For example, in 21% of the studies that were assessed for this kind of leukemia in adults, here we can see that there is a 21% of the studies where it is unclear, or it is a very high risk of bias, the actual source of the cases. Other parameters that make this even more complicated is that when you try to narrow your scope from the acute myeloid leukemia, which was the general scope of this effort, to subtype classification and identification, because now we know that we have diseases within the diseases. Here you see that in almost 60% of the studies, the classification of the leukemia is not there. So there is a high risk of bias for a problematic inference from this kind of literature. So again, here, these are all related to the pesticide exposure. The pesticide definition is largely problematic. The type of questionnaire is not usually mentioned, or is of high risk of bias. The probability of exposure assessment is prone to bias here, to introduce bias. And of course, the intensity of the pesticide exposure assessment is again a field where bias can actually operate and affect the results. What other aspects that are important is that there is a large number of studies where proper adjustment of the associations that are presented, and this is elementary, is not happening. So we also need to be careful, besides our typical exposure assessment problems, to the other aspects of the studies that are taken into consideration. And using and getting to the end of my points and looking forward to your questions, this is the IMPRESS project. This is something that tries to harmonize the exposure assessment related to occupational epidemiology, so that we will be able to actually standardize the way we are exposing this and we are assessing this. And we also need to take into consideration, going back to my first slides, that it is not only about toxicity. We, in the risk assessment, we are going to have to deal soon with problems about efficacy of specific interventions, of safety, of side effects, of test accuracy, most importantly, of pathogenicity, and other types of research questions where epi-study could play an important role. And finally, just two slides on biological plausibility, which is the looking for the Holy Grail. These are so complicated and accompanied by so much uncertainty that, again, when we try to support the epidata with biological plausibility, we need to take into consideration that we might have a single pathway that seems straightforward, going from chromosomal translocations, chimeric transcription, factors, etc., and leading to disease, to more complicated multi-level pathways where a large number of exposures can be and should be taken into considerations. And giving you my final slide, I would like to say that as in every aspect of technology and science, in pesticides, in the pesticide assessment of and its relationship to the outcomes that are related to health, it seems that it takes us a long time to get to this plateau of productivity. So in the beginning, there was this enthusiasm, high expectations about what we can do with the epidata. And now I think we are along this path of, no, we can't do it. There's a lot of criticism. It is difficult to do it actually. Many people are frustrated. But I think we need to work hard to reach this plateau of productivity and have a clear vision of the horizon, not like that. This was taken 2 days before in where I am now at the University of Ioannina. And with this, I would like to thank you for your attention and to say that I'm looking forward to any questions or further comments on that. Thank you, Jean-Noël.
Okay, thank you, Evangelia. Thank you very much. So I forgot to say to the audience that there is a Q&A frame that you have on your screen, and so you don't hesitate to use it to ask your questions, and then we try our best to give answers to them. So there is one first question by Jérôme Pierrard, and I think it's a question I also have. Can we know more about the IMPRESS project? So can you be more specific about who participates, who is funding it? Is it the EFSA? Is it an EFSA project, or is there another incentive to the project?
It is not an EFSA project. It is a European Union funded project. Which is multiply collaborative. We are not taking part of it, but I think it is a very important initiative in the field. They have already produced one publication coming out of it. This is the overview that I presented with indirect versus direct methods. And they have various working groups which one can participate and interact with. And also they have a couple of meetings that are going on there. So this is a new project from the view that I have. And I think that it is important and we're looking forward to the results, especially with regards to the methodology that they are going to present.
Okay. Maybe I'm gonna ask you one question, and then we're gonna leave the floor to Laura Beane Freeman. And then we can go back to your presentation for the general discussion at the end of the session. So I've got a question here. I'm just going to read it. I hope it makes sense. When combining all possible sources of bias, what was the share of studies that passed the quality assessment to support risk assessment when you perform your systematic review?
So I think that we can make a distinction here between hazard identification and risk characterization. In identifying hazard, I think we can make a lot with the epidata despite the sources of bias that are there. Mm-hmm. This is something that epidemiology is most helpful with. For the risk characterization, then the presence of bias is more problematic, can create more challenges, especially because we would need an extra methodological effort to try to quantify the level that bias contributes to the actual effect. So here, systematic review and meta-analysis is, of course, a way to move forward. So you address all the studies in the field and you try to come up with a summary effect. But here, as most of you know, we follow a distribution of effects, which is, again, a notion that can be difficult to grasp and implement in the risk assessment. So, as I said, it is different. We can set aside some of the bias options for the hazard identification process, while for the risk characterization process, we would need a more stringent analytical approach to be able to work with the epidata. And of course, the road ahead is open to other approaches, having prior probabilities and so on and so forth in this particular aspect.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for this presentation and these answers, which I think are very enlightening in the way, at least exposure assessment, among other possible biases, is really a key element of the interaction between epidemiology and public policy in the field of pesticide risk assessment.
Jean-Noël, if I may, exposure assessment does not always create bias. It can also dilute the effect. So it can work either way. So I think that, as you said, it's very complicated, but it can work in different ways there. But we can also make sense of it in most of the problems that we have.
Okay. Okay, so don't hesitate if you have questions, specific question for Evangelia, to ask them in the Q&A box, and then we can go back to the presentation at the end of the session. But right now I'm going to turn to Laura Beane Freeman, who is our second speaker. So she's an occupational and environmental epidemiologist at the National Cancer Institute in the United States. She has extensive expertise on the question of occupational hazards related to pesticides, in particular as the principal investigator of the American Agricultural Health Study, which is, to my knowledge, the oldest and probably one of the largest cohort of farmers exposed to pesticides, and which has provided a lot of epidemiological data since the beginning of the century. So I leave the floor to Laura. Thank you very much, Laura.
Thank you, Jean-Noël, and thank you for the invitation to present here today. I feel as though I should make a disclaimer. I am an epidemiologist who does a lot of work evaluating the effects of pesticides, and I am not a regulator. And so what I'm going to share is actually, I think, dovetails very nicely with what Evangelia said earlier. But I'm going to sort of hit on many of the same topics, but from the perspective of an epidemiologist actually conducting the work and trying to explain sort of perspectives and choices that we make and why we might make them. And I'm going to also give some examples from our agricultural health study cohort, as well as to speak about some of the approaches that the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has taken, again, speaking only from an outsider's perspective and not someone who's been involved in writing their frameworks. So, I was very interested in this topic, and the title of this breakout session, and I think that, balancing the societal demand with uncertain or uncomfortable knowledge, I think is a very good one. And I just wanted to point out, I think there is a huge societal demand for knowing what the effects of pesticides are, right? So these are ubiquitous exposures of almost 3 billion kilograms of pesticide active ingredients were applied worldwide in 2012. And clearly the use of these chemicals has grown over time since the middle of the last century. People are exposed, whether occupationally or not. In the United States, it's estimated that over 90% of Americans have detectable levels of pesticide biomarkers in their urine and blood. But of course, when we speak about pesticides, this is a very sort of reductive and all-encompassing word, right? Pesticides encompass hundreds of active ingredients that do everything from kill weeds to kill insects, control fungicides. They're used in farming applications and in residential and ornamental applications. And so I think that it's probably, I can't think of another broad group of chemicals that we would lump together in such a way and expect that this group would have some effect overall, because these chemicals act in very different ways. So we know that there's a lot of exposure, but there's certainly a lot that we don't know about the human health effects of pesticides. In most countries, pesticides must undergo a standard test prior to registration before they can be used. But these are mostly in vitro or animal studies, of course, because it wouldn't really be ethical to be dosing humans with these chemicals that are designed to kill other organisms. But there's very little post-market human data, so we have to wait until they're registered and then see what the effects are on humans. There are some systematic and surveillance systems that are in place in the United States anyway, and I assume elsewhere, but these mostly focus on acute or high exposure events, pesticide poisoning, these sorts of things, which are useful, but relatively rare, thankfully, and I'm not sure that they tell us much about the effects on chronic human disease. And then, of course, we have some epidemiologic studies, and these are focused on, just as there are hundreds of different chemicals, there are also hundreds of different outcomes that we have to take into account, and there are many different study designs that may be useful for the specific question being asked. As Evangelia indicated, there was a recent paper published in Occupational and Environmental Medicine that reviewed the methods that were used to assess pesticides in occupational epidemiology studies. And as she indicated, there were almost 1,300 publications published over the last 25 years, which equates to about 50 publications a year. But this encompasses all pesticides and all chronic diseases. As she indicated, 32% of these reported on pesticides in general, which are not particularly useful for a risk assessment perspective, but they're actually not all that useful for even understanding etiology. And about 16% reported based on job title only. So I was asked to write a commentary on this topic, sort of talking about some of the challenges, and I'm going to highlight some of those topics here that I included in that commentary. And I think before I get into that too, I also want to touch on something that Evangelia said about the indirect versus the direct methods of exposure. I think that when we're talking about chronic diseases, it's really not realistic to think that we can do direct exposure assessments over a long period of time, right? For chronic diseases, we're usually talking about a latency period. We're talking about chronic exposures, and given the short half-lives of many of these chemicals and the variability that I'm going to talk about in a minute, I think that it's a little, I wouldn't be so quick to dismiss some of the indirect methods when we're talking about chronic disease epidemiology in particular. So one thing, a concept that I think we should just keep in mind is that different agricultural exposures, practices influence exposure. So in industrialized countries or places where people are wearing personal protective equipment or have, farm equipment, tractors such that have, HEPA filters, these people may not actually have all that much exposure, even though they're actually applying a chemical. Where in other situations, people applying the same chemicals may have a very different exposure level. So I think it's something that you need to take into account when you're comparing across studies. Evangelia touched on this about low and middle income countries having high exposures. I think that's a really important point. Another thing to keep in mind, which sort of touches on this direct versus indirect method of exposure, is that exposures in most cases are actually intermittent and quite variable. We published a paper a few years ago looking at atrazine and 2,4-D levels in urine over a growing season in corn farmers. Now, I know in the EU that atrazine is not used anymore, but in the US, it's actually the second most commonly used herbicide after glyphosate. And you can see on the top panel that the levels of atrazine, an atrazine metabolite, really peak at the time of planting when the atrazine is applied, and really there's really no exposure over the growing season or nominal exposure over the growing season after that. And that's in contrast to 2,4-D, where there is exposure sort of continuously throughout the growing season, and that reflects how this herbicide is applied and what it's applied to. And I think these are just topics that I think are important to understand. When we're talking about chronic diseases, we also have to think about how changes may happen over time. This actually has an animation that I'm not sure actually shows up in this presentation, so I apologize. Basically, what this animation shows is the use patterns for two herbicides in the same chemical class, allichlor and acetochlor. And allichlor had been used for many decades, but in the mid-1990s, the registration was sort of reduced, whereas for acetochlor, the registration, it was just registered for use in the mid-1990s. And you can see that in 1992, there was no use of acetochlor, whereas for allichlor, there was a lot of use. And if I just tell you that at the end of 2012, this figure is actually basically reversed, where acetochlor has essentially replaced allichlor for use on corn crops. So we have to think about, old ingredients being phased out, new ingredients coming in. There are different patterns based on the introduction of genetically modified organisms in crops and changing farming practices as pests become resistant to one chemical or another. So how can we study the effects of pesticides from an epidemiologist perspective? What do you really need? You really want information on specific active ingredients. I think that really is key, to understand etiology. We do need a highly exposed population probably, because most of these effects, if there are effects, they probably are modest. If something was actually genotoxic or mutagenic, it probably wouldn't get approved by the EPA or by EFSA. So we're probably talking about subtle or modest effects. We need accurate characterization of exposure for exposure response. And depending on the actual study design, we either need a large population with sufficient follow-up in the case of a cohort study, or we need an adequate number of exposed cases for a case control study. I'm going to talk a little bit about our agricultural health study. As Jean-Noël indicated, this study has been going on since the mid-1990s. I think it actually would not have been possible at all without the involvement of 4 U.S. federal agencies: the National Cancer Institute, where I work, the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. And over time, all 4 of these agencies have really invested in this cohort, which makes it possible. So basically, the enrollment began in the mid-1990s. 57,000, it includes 57,000 licensed pesticide applicators, mostly farmers, and 32,000 of their spouses who may apply pesticides themselves or who may have bystander exposure by the fact that they live on a farm with someone who's applying pesticides. This is just a schematic describing the study. In the mid-1990s, when the applicators were recruited, they reported their lifetime use of pesticides. I'll get into some more of those details in a minute. And then after that, there were 2 follow-up questionnaires that were administered to update exposure information since the last follow-up. We also have done cancer and mortality linkages throughout the entire lifespan of the study. We have population registers in the 2 states, Iowa and North Carolina, that we can link to. And right now we have an average follow-up of over 20 years. The median age of the cohort is 67, so we're really getting into the prime years where cancers are starting to be diagnosed. And at this point, we have over 14,000 incident cancers in the applicators and the spouses. So our exposure assessment is based on the questionnaire responses on the use of specific pesticides and pesticide active ingredients. The farmers reported the years of use and the days per year of use of pesticides at enrollment, and we updated that information at the 2 follow-up surveys. We use this to create a lifetime days of use metric, and this metric is time dependent as we incorporate additional questionnaire data. Now, I wanted to say something about this reliance on questionnaires and self-report. We are concerned about, and we have been concerned about, the quality of those data and responses. In 2002, Aaron Blair published a paper showing that ag health study participants provide reproducible or reliable reports of their pesticide use. there was between 80 and 95% agreement on questionnaires that were administered a year apart for specific chemicals and application methods. And in the same year, Jane Hoppen published a paper looking at the pesticides that people reported using and comparing that with registration data to say, are these valid estimates? So is someone saying, in 2000, in the year 2000, are they still reporting that they're applying DDT? If that's the case, then that probably isn't a very valid response. And so she showed that over 95% of the applicators provided information that matched with market data. So as I showed earlier, there are a lot of things that can impact exposure and the intensity of exposure that a farmer would get. And that is the use of personal protective equipment, the application method, whether or not they're mixing chemicals themselves, and whether they repair the equipment. So our industrial hygienists came up with, used the literature to come up with some weighting factors to apply to our questionnaire data, and came up with an intensity score. And this score was then sort of evaluated in a couple of field studies that were conducted by Cindy Hines at NIOSH and Kent Thomas at the Environmental Protection Agency, and showed that this intensity weighting algorithm actually agreed pretty well with, had good agreement with urinary measures that were taken when people were actually doing field work. There were a few refinements that we made based on these field studies, and we published that in 2011. So then the health outcome ascertainment, I think, is another important piece of this. As I mentioned, we have the population-based registries for cancer incidents. For other health effects, unfortunately, we do not have a centralized healthcare system in the United States, so we often rely on self-report as an initial evaluation, but then we follow up with validation of medical records or independent medical evaluation by a medical professional in some cases. There are some other registries that exist, for example, the end-stage renal disease registry, which I know is this has been something that's been a lot of interest around the world, with sort of this kidney disease that has been observed in many parts of the world. And more recently, we've conducted a linkage to the Medicare system to try to get more valid information on medical conditions. And this is a system that provides health insurance for people in the United States over age 65. So using all these resources at our disposal, this is just sort of a listing of some of the papers that we've published in the last 5 years on specific, not only specific pesticide active ingredients, but also specific outcomes. You can see that we published a paper on bladder cancer risk with the use of different pesticides, or we looked at glyphosate and cancer incidence overall. Since I'm in the Cancer Institute, I'm focused on that, but our collaborators at the NIEHS have published many papers on other health outcomes as well. So I now want to switch gears a little bit and talk about the EPA's process of evaluating and incorporating epidemiology into their risk assessments. And again, this is my outsider's perspective, so this is all my personal opinion and not somebody who is involved in the EPA's process. As is the case, I think, worldwide, historically, hazards have been identified through animal studies, and this is really due to the lack of high-quality pesticide-specific epidemiologic data. But I think as more and more good data become available, there really is an impetus to incorporate these data into risk assessments. I guess it's no surprise that as a pesticide epidemiologist, I think that good studies should be used and incorporated into the risk assessments. So in 2016, the EPA's Office of Pesticide Programs published a framework for how they incorporate epidemiologic data into their risk assessments. They did hold a series of meetings and conversations with the public and invited us to participate in those conversations with them as they were developing that. But it's adapted from other guidance and frameworks, and they've now incorporated this into their part of their scheduled and special reviews as pesticides come up for re-registration. The Office of Pesticide Programs uses a weight of evidence approach that is similar to my understanding of what EFSA is using for their guidance. And it's really kind of a holistic attempt to integrate epidemiology with adverse outcome pathway and mechanism of action and toxicology data. But I would say, just from an epidemiologist perspective, and I think Evangelia touched on this a little bit, if we observe something in an epidemiologic study, but we don't understand how the pathway might operate, I think we should think carefully about our understanding of the toxicology and of these mechanisms of action, and not necessarily think, well, if we can't explain it, then it must not be real. So I think that's just my sort of epidemiologist hat, I guess. These are the key criteria that the Office of Pesticide Programs has put out for evaluating epidemiologic studies. Now, I think that this is, pretty standard for the evaluation of epi studies in general, but I did want to point out just a few things. One is this idea of what a quality study is. They have listed cohort studies as high quality, and the agricultural health study is a cohort study, and I think generally can provide some high quality data. But I guess what I quibble with a little bit is this reductive approach of automatically saying that a case control study is only of moderate quality, or that a cross-sectional study is of low quality, because I think that in certain circumstances, those studies can actually provide a lot of data that even a cohort study can't get you, particularly when I'm thinking about rare outcomes. Even just staying in the cancer realm, we have a study of 57,000 pesticide applicators that we have been following for 25 years, and we still only have, about 200 cases of brain cancer, for example. And when you then start to look at these specific active ingredients, you really run out of numbers really quickly. Whereas a case control study, you can select people who have the outcome of interest and then evaluate the exposures. So I think that, there are times and places for each study design. And I think it's a little simplistic to simply discount them based on the study design out of the gate. The other thing I want to say about cross-sectional studies is that particularly when we're looking at intermediate endpoints, these can be really valuable studies, and they can provide really valuable, biological plausibility insights. We talked about exposure assessment. I won't spend a lot more time on that. But I did also just then want to say something about this idea that appropriate confounder control is a big problem. I think that, this is sort of one of the boogeymans of epidemiology, right? That people are scared. You say confounder control and people think, oh, it must be some unknown confounder. You didn't control for confounding. But I think it's really, it's imperative for the people who are making that argument to specify what that confounder must be, right? Because in order for something to actually impact the association, it must be associated both with the outcome and with the exposure. And so, you're hard pressed to sort of think about that outside, it would really create such an association. There aren't all that many strong risk factors that would also be associated with the exposure of interest. So I think it's important, but I don't want to overemphasize it. So I don't want to take too much time, but the EPA has developed a 3-tiered approach for evaluating their epidemiology studies. And the highest tier, or tier 3, includes an integrated epidemiology review with the tox data and the animal data. I just wanted to give one example. In 2017, they produced their tier 2 review of epidemiologic studies for permethrin, which is a pyrethroid insecticide. And I think that it's really important to think about, so permethrin is a really, it's widely used around the world. And you can see that for even these individual cancer sites, there were only 1 or 2 studies that actually evaluated permethrin. And so I think that, and many of these actually were the agricultural health study data. So I think that we really need, more good studies of commonly used chemicals. And I want to just dive a little bit deeper on multiple myeloma a bit. Multiple myeloma it's been observed across many studies to be increased in farmers around the world. And that's true in the agricultural health study compared to the general population. Multiple myeloma is preceded by an asymptomatic precursor called MGUS, and we also observed that there was an excess of MGUS in our AHS cohort. Permethrin is a synthetic pyrethroid insecticide, and it's widely used for vector control, for control of insects. It's widely used for impregnating clothing for recreational and military use, so it has a lot of exposure in the general population. And in the ag health study, we observed an increased risk of multiple myeloma for people who had the higher exposure. And this was incorporated, and actually is the study that is cited in the Tier 2 assessment. But, you know, the EPA in their assessment said, well, we don't really think that there's there isn't a reason to think that, you know, permethrin causes multiple myeloma, but we'll continue to monitor multiple myeloma relative to permethrin exposure. So we've tried to get some data to sort of inform this. And we recently published papers showing that permethrin use is associated with specific immunologic perturbations, and that we also have now shown, just in a paper published last month, an association between recent use of permethrin and this myeloma precursor. So just some closing thoughts. In their 2016 document, where the EPA outlined their framework for the incorporation of epidemiology, they also state that basically for the time being, experimental laboratory data will continue to be the primary source of data in their quantitative risk assessment. And so I hope that that doesn't remain the case going into the future, because more epidemiologic data are becoming available. We're having more specific information on pesticides and health outcomes and intermediate endpoints, as well as emerging technologies and methods. And I think that, you know, this careful incorporation of human data into risk assessment is important, and a communication between the epidemiologists conducting the research and the risk assessors doing the evaluation. And I want to thank my collaborators, and if you want more information about the agricultural health study, you can find it here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Laura. Thank you for this talk, which I think is going along the line of how difficult the production of epidemiological data can be on pesticides' effect on health, in particular in terms of how exposure assessment can be tricky. It's very useful to have this explanation on the fact that occupational exposure to pesticide is so difficult to catch because of its being intermittent and variable, as you said. I think I've got two questions on the intensity score algorithm you used in the agricultural health study. Well, I'm not a specialist, so I hope my questions will make sense. But the first question is that I see that you use the wear of PPE in the equation, and I was just wondering how you attribute protection factors to PPE, because as you may know, there has been a lot of discussions here in France, at least, and probably in Europe, about the protective factors attributed to PPE, to protective equipment in the risk assessment process. So what are you doing in terms of attributing protection factor to PPE? And the second question is also on the intensity score algorithm is. Has there been any discussion at the EPA on the possible use of this algorithm, not for epidemiological study, but for risk assessment purposes? I mean, could we imagine that it could be integrated in risk assessment, or is it totally out of the question?
Well, I'm going to take your second question first and say that since I don't work at the EPA, I hesitate a little bit to respond, but I know that they are considering I know that they are interested in the use of PPE, and there are labeling factors. One thing that I find interesting is that the pesticides all have labels on them, and they say what PPE is supposed to be used. But I think that it's probably a little bit naive to think that that is always applied, by the farmer or the person who is using those chemicals.
Probably.
So I think that is something, from a personal perspective. Actually, what I didn't say is that I actually grew up on a farm in Iowa, and I I have a lot of exposure myself as a kid, so you know, I feel like I have the real world experience as well. About your question of how we considered the use of personal protective equipment. So the way that the algorithm was developed was by first reviewing the literature and seeing what the literature said about what reduction factors should be assigned to different types of personal protective equipment. And then, as I mentioned, the EPA, Office of Research and Development, and the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health actually conducted field studies and observed people in real-world situations applying pesticides, and observed the personal protective equipment that they were using, observed what they reported, and also did urinary and skin wipe measurements so that they could quantify the reduction factors. And what they found was that the biggest predictor of reduction of exposure was the use of chemically resistant gloves, which was a reduction factor of, I think, 0.6. But I think that we have to be very careful when we think about the use of personal protective equipment, because a chemically resistant glove provides a lot of protection, but the use of a non-chemically resistant glove can actually increase exposure if it gets into the cloth or the leather and actually be a source of ongoing exposure. So I think that we really have to be very careful about assigning attributes to what actual real-world situations are.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much, Laura. I think there will be other questions about your talk for the general session, but I think we should proceed with our third speaker, who is François Dedieu. So François is a sociologist as myself, and he's a researcher at the French National Agronomic Research Center, the INRAE, at the LISIS, and he has realized several surveys, and some of them with me, indeed, on the frictions between science and public policies in the field of occupational health issues related to pesticides. So, François, I leave the floor to you for 20 minutes.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. So, as you said, now we change the gaze, because I will present some insight and results of the sociological research that I've conducted along with you, Jean-Noël, but also with Giovanni Pretz, on the social production of ignorance on pesticide hazards, and in particular, as you said, in occupational health area. So, maybe you know, but for a recent tradition of social studies, ignorance is not caused by the sole scientific uncertainties, but also by the social and political factors. For instance, as you see here, Robert Proctor in his famous book, Golden Holocaust, have shown how in the late 60s, the tobacco industry has set up a particular strategy to maintain doubts on the tobacco health hazards. And for many, the same goes for pesticides. So it's hard to deny that corporate influence exists in the fight of pesticides. For instance, the Monsanto papers published by the World Press 3 years ago has revealed the strategy of disinformation set up by Monsanto in the glyphosate case through the phenomena of ghostwriting mainly. So corporate influence on ignorance manufacture is now a dominant idea in the media, but also in a society. Yet this popularity obscures some research questions. Indeed, one can ask to what extent the industrial lobby can shape official knowledge production. And more specifically, are the individual cases, such as the biologist Henry Miller, pointed by the Monsanto papers, as you can see here in the slide, are enough to explain why some pesticide hazards are not recognized. So it seems hard to imagine a large conspiracy in which all the policymakers, experts, and officials involved in pesticides management would be mechanically captured by private interests. So along with my colleague, we decide to follow another perspective. We draw the hypothesis that ignorance, an hypothesis may be more uncomfortable, that ignorance is also manufactured by official tools and science in charge of environmental risk assessments. So drawing on the methodology of qualitative sociology, we have studied the concrete functioning of the French pesticide risk management system. And when I mean system, I mean the large group of stakeholders involved more or less directly in this regulation implementation. So who are these actors? They are the regulators, of course, and when I mean regulators, I mean the National Food Security Agency, the Anses, in French, in charge of the risk assessment, the Ministry of Agriculture, in charge of the final decision of commercialization till 2015, but also the industrials, the main user of the pesticides, the farmers, and the environmental NGO. So we have conducted plenty of interviews among these actors. So, in order to highlight how official tools maintain ignorance, we choose to study a particular problem. We have studied situations when the risk management system cope with what we call uncomfortable knowledge. So what it is? Uncomfortable knowledge can be defined as every knowledge, alarms, or scientific studies that challenge directly the conclusion and postulates of the regulatory toxicology used in the first registration procedure that allow, as you may know, the commercialization of these chemicals. These kind of knowledge are so-called uncomfortable because they pose serious threats for the functioning, but also for the legitimacy of the whole risk management system. So let me take you an example that we have studied with Jean-Noël and Giovanni Pret. A few years ago in France, epidemiological scholars have shown that the individual protective equipment, the PPE, you know the acronym now, were not waterproof to pesticides. In particular, regulators realized at this moment that the European permeation test standard used for worker protection recommendation did not include chemical used in agriculture. So the disclosure was particularly embarrassing. PPE recommendations are indeed directly integrated into accepted risk exposure calculation threshold. In particular, this alert raised two very awkward questions. The first one, do the model setting used for worker exposure calculation rely on the same test standard challenged by the PPE alert? And second, since when products have been commercialized based on this false or at least incomplete calculation? Two awkward questions. So, because it's too uncomfortable to consider, there's a need to deny this knowledge. So our research highlights that the risk management system developed at this moment a process I have called an organized denial when the system comes to face uncomfortable knowledge. Organized denial is a two-level process, which has both a visible side, but also a hiding side, I will call an invisible architecture. So I will quickly sum up both of these dimensions now. So first, what we discover with my colleague is the complex set of rules, norms, and science of this system provide the resources to subtly exclude this knowledge. So in this kind of anti-reflexivity process, if you want, officials aim to recognize uncomfortable knowledge, criticism, while seeking to make them consistent with the principle and rules of risk management. So there are different strategies to domesticate uncomfortable knowledge. So let me just give you two, relying on these case studies, the PPE alert. So the first one is what I call, as you can see here, the limited change. Uncomfortable knowledge often triggers change within the system because they are hard to simply deny. Yes, as costly as they may be, these changes do not modify the rule and the functioning of risk regulation. For instance, the PPE alert leads to the modification of risk assessment calculations. The simulation of exposure risk now take better account of different sequences of pesticide use. Now we can have a differentiation between transport, loading, mixing, and so on. The individual protection recommendation may now differ according to these different phases. This change was a direct response to the PPE alert, stating that the risk scenario were too far from the real condition of farmers' exposure. But in reality, this new protocol complicated expertise work without disrupting it. It remains sufficiently standardized to keep a distance from multiple real exposure situations. So the second strategy to domesticate uncomfortable knowledge is a kind of reasoning, is what we call the promise of improvement. Experts and officials skip questions, for instance, about the capacity of this new sequencing of risk exposure to grasp the heterogeneity of exposure situations. According to them, this change will certainly improve the proximity between risk scenario and real exposure condition. In other words, the safety of agricultural workers will be increased, no doubt about it. But the promise of improvement also allowed experts, but also other regulators, to avoid uncomfortable questions about the past. As I said before, how many products were authorized under conditions of inefficient PPE, and since when? But the promise of improvement discouraged any looking back. The reasoning is the following. It is no longer necessary to question past decisions since this dysfunction had been recognized and lesson learned. What is the point? So as you see, these mechanisms show that there is a systematic exclusion of uncomfortable knowledge. So the question that remains now is where this safe reinforcing process come from? So I've shown with my colleague that this process finds its roots in a second level, in a less visible one I call an invisible architecture. This architecture is defined as a combination of two factors that maintains ignorance on the same issue, which is the potential unrealism of regulatory toxicology. In other terms, within this system, no one's really want to know whether the official protocol and test used in risk assessment can really measure the large scope of pesticide hazards. So these two factors are, as you can see, first the history of this risky system, and two, a sum of implicit agreements. So I use the metaphor here of architecture because like the component of a building, the two, one support the other. So I will sum up it quickly. The first pillar is the risk management system history. Regulatory toxicology is used in France and later on in Europe to commercialize pesticides since the end of the Second World War. For more than 70 years now, regulators have responded to criticism and controversies on pesticides by strengthening the test and protocol of the regulatory toxicology. On the long run, there is more and more activity, more organization, more actors involved in this regulatory science production, which have a particular outcome. It gives to this particular kind of knowledge production a discrete form of hegemony that contributes to hamper its radical questioning. So, the second pillar of this architecture is now a sum of tacit agreements among the variety of actors, stakeholders involved in this public policy. So as you can see in that slide, this public policy can be roughly sketched with three main coalitions of actors. As you see on the left, you have the pro-pesticides, in which we can find agribusiness industry, the Ministry of Agriculture, and farmer. Why pro-pesticide? Because all these actors need pesticide to fulfill their activity more or less indirectly. And then we have on the right the anti-pesticide coalition, composed by environmental NGO, independent journalists, and also some politicians. They are so-called anti-pesticide because they try to denounce the harmful effect of pesticide and mostly the unknown harmful effect on pesticide on environment and also human health. So, as you can imagine, the two coalitions are radically in conflict. And in the middle lies the official scientific expertise represented by the French Food Security Agency, the Anses. Anses plays in this game the role of the referee, if you want to. It is the figure of the objective and impartial science supposed to solve conflict between two opposed coalitions. Yet, behind this visible game, there's a hiding one, shaped by several implicit agreements around ignorance of the limits of the regulatory toxicology. So let me just give you two examples of these tacit agreements. So the first one is between the anti and pro-pesticides coalition, which a priori seems totally at odds. The anti-pesticide coalition alarms public opinion on pesticide hazard downplay by denouncing every time they can conflict of interest within the regulatory system. We have seen, for instance, an example recently in France with the ASDHI controversy. So this is a common belief for this actor, but also a strategic resource. Denouncing regulatory capture allows this actor to have a direct access to mass media. And for most of them, this is a crucial stake. Some environmental NGOs in particular want to increase their notoriety to legitimize their crusade, as Gusfield would have said, but also attract new members in order to secure their funding. Yet, this strong focus on corporate influence distracts them from the critics of the ability of regulatory science to assess the large scope of pesticide hazards. But more important, this focus on regulatory capture serves indirectly the interest of the pro group. Indeed, the pro-pesticide coalition has absolutely no interest in challenging the test and protocol of risk assessments because it favors the fluidity of the pesticides market. Indeed, either farmers and the Ministry of Agriculture want the widest catalog of chemicals possible in order to increase crop protection safety guarantees. The second tacit agreement regards the Food Security Agency and the agribusiness industry. Agency takes great care to keep industrials away from their expertise production so as not to fuel suspicion of conflict of interest. And they do, I can testify about it. But in reality, both tacitly agreed to protect risk standardization legitimacy. For agribusiness industry, the research and development process of a new molecule takes roughly 10 years. So the worst scenario for agribusiness industry is the early ban of a new project, few years after its first approval. Because in this case, all their business plan fall apart. So for the industry, risk standardization compliance is a means to secure commercial objectives. But in turn, this compliance facilitates and, most important, accelerates the agency expertise bureaucratic work. And this is a serious help for agency who systematically exceed regulatory deadlines for about 1 or 2 years. So as a consequence, the Food Security Agency and the agribusiness industry have the common interest in protecting risk standardization, and more specifically, stability. For agencies, both at the national and European level, any change in risk standardization is a long and costly administrative process. And for industry, any change as a source of commercial uncertainties. So I will conclude now, very briefly. I want to stress just 2 points regarding our session question. The first one, ignorance is not manufactured by particular actors as powerful as they are. Willful ignorance is rather provoked by a given social and political configuration, meaning that the combination of various actors, logics, and action, including the opponents of this politics. I mean, in other terms, there is no particular responsible for ignorance production, but a system as a whole. So the second conclusion, this organized denial is a collective anti-reflexivity process, which is true, favors economic interest. Yet, what it has taken in this denial process is more a search for consistencies than the defense of economic interest per se. In other terms, if officials deny knowledge about pesticide hazard, uncomfortable knowledge, it's essentially because they're trying to be consistent with their mission rather than to be submitted to private interest. So I finish here, and I would be happy to have some questions, remarks.
Okay, thank you very much, François. I think I've got one question for you at least. It's maybe you can come back to one of the concepts of your slides, which I found rather intriguing, which is the concept of anti-reflexivity. So I think that I may not be the only one to be a bit surprised by this concept. So maybe coming back to the concept briefly to the concept of reflexivity in sociology, you could explain us more specifically what anti-reflexivity is.
Okay, you're right. Maybe it's too sociological term. So to be short, anti-reflexivity is the opposite of reflexivity. Reflexivity means that you have a critical view about what you are doing. And the anti-reflexivity is the opposite. It means that you will go following up all your routine and so on and so forth. So the concept I'm trying to defend here is that this whole system produces a collective anti-reflexivity process. I mean that all the actors involved in the risk assessment or in the risk management know perfectly the limits of the regulatory science or what we call ignorance. But the system functioning as a whole creates a collective anti-reflexivity process. I mean that it means that this system follow as if there is no uncomfortable knowledge. So to be brief and to be clear, the anti-reflexivity process means that all the system is not able to grasp and to learn lessons from uncomfortable knowledge. I hope I was clear.
So maybe just to open up a general discussion, I think I will have questions for Evangelia and Laura based on François' talk, and I'm not quite sure if both of you are aware of this of what François referred to as the PPE alert. So it's because maybe it's a very French story, but basically it revolves around the production 15 years ago by a team of epidemiologists and ergonomic researchers of data indicating that in the vineyards workers wearing coveralls could be in some situations more exposed to pesticides, more contaminated by some pesticides than workers who didn't wear coveralls. So I was just wondering, as an epidemiologist, how you integrate this kind of data in your personal practice. I mean, is it something that what are your views on this data? Laura and Evangelia, I don't know if one of you wants to go first.
I'm happy to maybe respond first. I think it's sort of you sort of asked a question at the end of my presentation that sort of relies, but as I understand the situation in France sort of touches on this, and I think so the idea is that people who use PPE may actually be increasing their exposure. Is that what I understand? So if the personal protective equipment is not actually appropriate, is that sort of the general issue?
Well, François, maybe you want to
Yeah, but because there was twofold problem. The first one is we didn't know exactly how the workers were exposed to pesticide, and if they indeed were the PPE correctly and so on. So it was the first issue. But the second issue, which was more uncomfortable, is that the test permeation was not based on the chemical use in agriculture, but also the chemical use in industry. So there was a big failure in the test permeation. And so this alert raised this issue too. So I think there's the twofold situation. So the first one is what is the real exposure? Where the workers, the farmers are wearing correctly the PPE and to what extent? And then based on what the model exposure can calculate the efficiency of the PPE.
Jean-Noël, if I may add to that, I think that Laura's comment is exactly what I also have in mind. So we know from the literature that protective measures can shift the risk perception from the user. So here, this is a cognition bias, so to say. This is something that creates an opposite effect. And this is the part that François would be more interested, I would guess. But as he also highlighted, this is also a technical aspect. So going back to the basics of epidemiology methods is that you need to describe the intervention in detail. So again, as we have used for many years the any pesticide definition in the EPI studies, again here, when we adjust for PPE, for example, we need to exactly say what we mean by that. So this is becoming trendy. It's there. We should say something about it, but we need to be now more specific. We need urgently to be more specific because, as we mentioned in all three of our presentations, that we need now to make it a bit more about the intervention. So this blunt and, so to say, observational part that nothing happens, we just have people exposed. We know that we can modify exposure, actively modify exposure. And this is not included well in the EPI studies, in the vast majority of the EPI studies as well.
And I think also when doing the risk assessments and the regulation, it's sort of the ideal worker, right? The ideal person who is following all of the rules, and that we know that that is not necessarily usually true, probably. And just another sort of anecdote on this idea of sort of getting surprising or opposite results of what you might see. We did a literature review of non-occupational exposures to pesticides. And, you know, one of the things that people are told here is that, you know, you should wash your clothes separate from where you're, when you're applying pesticides, you should wash them separately from the farmer or from the rest of the household clothing. And a group out of the University of Washington did a study where actually they showed that people who did that had higher levels of pesticide metabolites in their blood, but actually, or in their urine. But it probably is a bias of reverse causation, because when do you wash your clothes separately from the rest of the household clothing? When you know that you spilled pesticides on them. So I think that, you know, we have to be very carefully defining what our question is and what the intervention is, so that we don't end up with these sort of surprising results. And we have to think about this very carefully.
Okay, thank you. This leads me to a question to you, Laura. In your talk, you mentioned the fact that epidemiological studies of pesticides' effects on human health probably need to be done on highly exposed populations. So I was just wondering what to put exactly behind this category of highly exposed population. And does that mean that epidemiological data can be produced regarding pesticides' effects on health only on farmers and farm workers, or in occupational in an occupational context, and does that exclude environmental exposure that probably are not as high as occupational ones. And does that exclude food exposure? We've got a question on food safety and exposure to pesticide residues on food. Is this kind of topic totally out of the reach of epidemiological studies right now or in the future, to your view? And Evangelia, maybe you have views on that also.
So thank you for that question, because it provides me an opportunity to clarify what I meant by that. So I think that in an initial study, it's useful to focus on the highly exposed populations because of probably modest level risks, right? So if you see it in a highly exposed population, then you can turn your attention to a more modest exposed population and environmental exposure. Just because I think we highlighted the challenges of doing pesticide epidemiology, and I think that's why I think it's useful to focus initially on highly exposed populations and then the lower exposed populations once you see something in the high exposed populations. With regarding food, I think that's a real challenge. I think it's a really important potential route of exposure, but it raises whole other issues of the exposure assessment, because people get their food from all over, and so they don't know what the pesticides were sprayed on the foods. You don't know how they're handling it. If you're doing direct exposure methods, urinary method measurements, it really, because you have such short half-lives of these pesticides, and people's diets are variable, it's really a challenge. But I think that probably a better approach might be to think about modeling, doing the epi studies where you can do a better job of characterizing exposure over a long period of time, and then characterizing what the exposure is and maybe intermediate endpoints in people through a dietary route.
Okay. Evangelia, maybe you got an answer?
I think that I wouldn't have anything more to say to add to what Laura said. I just wanted to say that high exposure environments are a unique opportunity to study health effects. We don't want them, but since they exist, I think we need to understand, and this also has to do with low-income countries where we need to promote research there. It is absolutely important, because we have this unique, undesirable situation that we have high exposure environments.
Okay. Thank you. This leads me to a question raised by someone in the audience. So I just read it. Would epidemiological studies be considered, should epidemiological studies should be considered as a tool to identify dangers which might not yet be covered by the regulatory science implemented to assess risks? And in that sense, shouldn't these epidemiological studies be considered as precursors of further new regulatory tests to be identified? I mean, is it a way to articulate epidemiology and risk assessment in the field of pesticides?
That's a good one. It's a tricky one, I think, because this is the exposome. Okay, so the answer is, the question is, can we go forward with an agnostic way to put everything in our box and say, okay, let's see what comes up. So this is emerging, this is valuable. There are associations that could come up from investigations such as that could be considered early on in the risk assessment process. We do not exclude them. We know that these they undergo a more stringent control for false positive rates, etc. It's a different approach, different methodology, but it is possible. It is not formal. I think that at this point we are not mature enough to fully incorporate them, and I'm saying this as a personal view. But I think that this is a consideration that we will deal with in the near future.
Okay, Laura.
François, did you want to respond?
Just a question, sorry, but go on, Laura.
I sort of interpreted the question a little bit different than Evangelia, and I do agree with you that the exposome may be appropriate and useful, but I think I agree with you that we're early in that arena. But I also think that, you know, sometimes when I talk to risk assessors or toxicologists, sometimes they say, well, you have this epi finding, but it doesn't match with what our understanding of the toxicology or the mechanism of action of that pesticide is. So therefore, we're going to discount the epidemiology. And, you know, I guess I would say that maybe using that as a screener and maybe trying to then understand the biologic plausibility of that unexpected or surprising epidemiologic finding actually is useful and as part of the risk assessment process in just hazard identification.
Okay. There is a... Yes, François, go ahead with your question.
I have a question, Chairman, if you want to, if you don't mind. Yes, I have a question for maybe both of you, but maybe especially for Angela. I was wondering to what extent the guidelines and the model exposure setting are flexible. Let's say that we will have a new kind of knowledge on exposure, as you say. So is it possible to integrate them very quickly and very easily in these guidelines and these model settings? Because I know the expertise work, and I know that experts rely on particular kinds of models. And these models have particular settings.
I think that one of the main characteristics of the models that we use and we don't use, of all models actually, is their plasticity. So you can extend them, you can change the parameters, you can integrate other methodologies. So I think that what we need, so technically anything is possible. But your question is very important, François. At which point do you integrate, do you allow a model to become an official approach? This is something that is not a research endeavor we're talking about here, okay? To see how different models behave or different model parameters behave. This is something that affects policy making, and for that we need to have a very fine balance between innovation and not creating, not introducing, and validity. So this is not an easy question. That's why I'm talking a lot about it. So, but there is a sensitivity from the regulators and from the risk assessors. They acknowledge that they are evolving a lot, and these should be taken into account. But it is difficult. It is difficult from the regulatory bodies. It is difficult to quickly accept new notions into the modeling process. And this can usually be more easily done when we have an emergency. Okay, so there you need all the tools you have, and you have your uncertainty can be widened. There is no formal procedure for that. By definition, we should include there a very strong component of expert elicitation, expert knowledge elicitation. So this is a difficult question, quite a lot. And I wonder, Laura, I'm sure she would have much more to say. We need a formal structure for it, for sure.
Laura?
Yeah, that is a hard question, and I think it is really important, because I think, you know, you want to have confidence in the regulatory process, right? So there's standardization of the regulatory process. But on the other hand, again, I'm not a regulator or a risk assessor, but I think sometimes people have frustrations, and sometimes myself included, in that some of the processes that have been developed seem too rigid to account for new data or new kinds of data or unexpected data, right? Because sometimes it feels like, well, the risk assessors want to see what they expect to see so that they can regulate. And unfortunately, science, and particularly observational science, often doesn't fit into that neat category, right? Because there's a lot of messiness around it.
Okay, I should add that there are some comments from the audience on your talk, François, stressing that you don't mention the fact that the risk assessment procedure are constantly evolving and constantly improving and permanently trying to integrate new data. Just a personal comment on that. I would just like to stress the fact that the OECD guideline on the occupational occupational exposure assessment for pesticide dates back to 1997. So I guess it's not always evolving at a really quick pace, at least in some of the fields covered by risk assessment procedures. Yeah, François.
I will follow you on that, and mentioning too that this is the case for occupational health studies, but also for other areas such as the bees, for instance, bees exposure. If you follow the difficulty to change the guidelines of bee exposure, it took like 8 to almost many years, 6 or 7 years, I think, to change the guidelines. So I think it would be hard to say that all this regulatory science, I mean this mix of norm and science, is really flexible and able to adapt to every new age. I'm not so sure about that, sorry. I know that the regulators and the experts try to do their best to evolve with this new knowledge, but it's not so easy, because when you change the guidelines, you need to change the guidelines at the European level. So you need the agreements of all the countries too. So this is, as I mentioned in my presentation, this is a complex bureaucratic process too. But it is not so flexible.
There are some policy questions that seems to be addressed primarily to François, but I think Evangelia and Laura, you feel free to respond to them. So I grouped these questions. François, what would you suggest to curb or to reverse the anti-reflexivity system you have so well described? And going along these lines, the other question is if all the stakeholders share this organized denial that you described, where can the change come from? Which governance system would allow progress? It's a difficult question, but I leave it to you.
It's a really difficult question, but I will say very quickly and very roughly, and maybe to be more provocative, that I think that the solution came less from the science than from the market. Well, I think in France in particular, the main problem is that we have this system, this registration system is totally overwhelmed by the products you have to control. So I think one of the issue and one of the future challenge is to lower the pressure of chemicals that enter in the country. And in order to do that, I think we need to think of a new system to have a free agriculture of pesticide, agriculture that able to use less pesticide. So this is the main goal, and this is not easy. But I think we didn't try every solution on that. In France, the main tool is, you know of Jean-Noël, is the main tool is the Plan Ecophyto that try to lower the pressure of pesticide and reduce the production of pesticide. And this is not a surprise to say that this plan has failed for many reasons. But I think one of the solutions is to change the market and change the market rule. And just to give you an example, and we are trying to do more research at the INRA currently on that issue, is that to change the consumer preference and trying to find, for instance, maybe a solution to give new labels with pesticides-free products that can be change the preference of consumers and then lower the pressure of pesticide. So I think that science can bring solution, but the pressure of the products are too high nowadays. So I think that's one of the solutions is to, again, lower that pressure. And I think it will be trigger a virtuous circle, because it will be easier for the experts to have a better evaluation, better risk assessment with a low pressure of pesticide to assess.
Laura, you have any clue to make things work better in terms of
everyone is each and every one of us is affected by our personal view. For example, my notion for the way forward would be the comparative safety approach. So we have so many products in the market. We need some way to establish a weighting model that would allow the consumer to know which, or maybe all the products are equally hazardous, you know. But I think that this notion of knowing that something, even though it is equally efficacious, it can have is associated with different risks for specific diseases, is something that could contribute to the field. Of course, this opens a huge area of shared decision making, of decision analysis, of comparative research, and so on and so forth. It's not easy, but it could work as an anchor for the way forward. And continuing your concerns, so to say, François, about how quickly the field evolves, I think what is a need in the field is to support the research that is related to regulatory sciences. So in order for the field to change in practice, you need to have a strong research background that would support this change. So risk assessors cannot do anything, you know, they are not the ultimate wise ones in the field.
Laura?
Yeah, I was going to say something on this topic, and Evangelia brought it up, is, you know, not all pesticides are created equal, right? So we know that, you know, so the organochlorines were banned because they were persistent, and that's actually probably why we study them a lot, because they're easy to study, right? We know a lot about them because they stick around. But some of the things that were introduced to replace them actually may have, there's more evidence of worse health effects. And so I think that, you know, it might be a goal to reduce the level or the use of pesticides overall, but I guess where I come from is that I would like to know which of the pesticides are the bad actors. Some of them are clearly worse than others, and I think that focusing on that, you know, I think that it's probably unrealistic, even if we would like that to be in a utopian world, that we're not going to use pesticides. They do provide some useful, you know, they do some useful things, or we wouldn't use them, particularly in terms of vector control and disease prevention, particularly, you know, clearly as we're facing the market realities of increasing food production for an increasing population. I would like to see pesticides being reduced, but I think that overall, but I think we also need to focus on those that are the bad actors, those that cause the most problems, and get those off the market, so to speak.
Okay, thank you. There are just a set of questions on which are not on the topic of human health, but more on biodiversity. So I know that none of you are specialists, but maybe you've got comments in terms to these questions. One comment stresses the fact that regarding bees and the effects of pesticides on bees, bee guidance is a special example because of the complexity of risk assessment, which makes the testing very difficult. And there is another comment saying, as a citizen, I am concerned by the lack of transparency and information regarding pesticides, metabolites as water pollutants, and their potential direct and indirect impacts on biodiversity. So I don't know if any of you have comments for that, for that questions or remarks. Don't be shy.
I would say I would say as little as we know about the
For my
direct
part,
effects
maybe.
of the pesticides, we know even less about what the metabolites and the environmental fate and transport has to do with health effects. And I agree, it's this sort of black box. These chemicals get out into the environment, and we don't have a good understanding of how they might impact our health, and also clearly it has impacts on the biodiversity of the region as well.
Okay. Evangelia,
I haven't worked on that, but I know that, for example, the US approach is more active, is stronger in terms of water quality and water contamination. It's true, I think that in Europe, we are not lagging, but I think we are not that active in that. But that's something that I don't know well.
Okay.
I just want to make one comment on that. In that, I just one chemical example. I presented a slide that showed data from atrazine and atrazine recapturate, and I know that in the EU it's been banned since 2006. And so often when I talk about atrazine, with people from Europe, they said nobody uses that because it's not, it's been banned because of the persistence in water and the damage to the wildlife. Where here, it's the second most commonly used herbicide. You spray it all over. So I think, there are certainly country and continent specific differences and weighting different types of data differently.
Okay, François, I know you have to leave a bit earlier, so
yeah, I have to leave. So I'm sorry.
Yes,
I'm sorry. I have to fetch my kids, and it's almost 6 o'clock. But I just want.
Okay, so. Okay, so
yeah,
the
sure.
last question.
I wanted to add something about solutions also. So tell me.
So the question is, I like your concept about uncomfortable knowledge, but you go back to conspiracy and ignorance. But to go back to conspiracy and ignorance, would the fact that knowledge creates uncomfort be a sufficient reason to make it real and a sign of progress?
All right. Did you understand, Jean-Noël? As far as I has understood it, that means that the uncomfortable knowledge
maybe, I don't know. I just
speaking about conspiracy, right? No, is that?
Yeah.
I'm sorry for the asker. So I mean, for uncomfortable knowledge, is that this knowledge is how can I say? Is a mean to show that this system is following consistencies, because it wants to avoid and deny as I say, every knowledge that can challenge all the postulates and conclusion of the risk assessment.
Is that enough to make it relevant for policy purpose? I mean, not all uncomfortable. Yeah.
Oh yes, I think it's relevant. Oh yes, I think it's relevant. It's coming back to your first questions about reflexivity. I think it's regulators should consider uncomfortable knowledge in the sense that it shows perfectly the limits of regulatory science. But now it doesn't mean that you have to consider every uncomfortable knowledge, but at least to consider it. And in every case I have studied with you, my friend Jean-Noël, we have shown that all the regulators and officials trying to deal with the knowledge, but at least at the end avoiding. And I think that regulators and officials and experts should have at least a consideration for uncomfortable knowledge. But this is a tricky problem, because regulators and officials will say that we consider this kind of knowledge.
You have to go,
but in fact they don't.
My friend.
Yeah, I have to go. I'm sorry, Laura, Evangelia. It was a pleasure to have a chat with you, and sorry for to leave you
Pity.
earlier.
Okay,
but
thank you very much,
the
François,
curfew is
for your talk. And maybe anyway, we're very close to the end of the session. Maybe one final question for both of you as epidemiologists, going back to the exposome, because you mentioned it. What I was thinking, listening to your talks, both of you, is that, of course, so there is this strong trend in environmental and occupational health towards exposome and the will to aggregate at the individual level and through the whole life course every environmental exposure. But listening to your talks and given the difficulties you pointed about how to assess risk, how to evaluate exposure to pesticides, I was thinking that probably we're pretty far right now to this dream of being able to totalize every environmental exposure into a single exposome for every individual. But maybe you have a comment on that. I mean, besides pesticides, going further than only pesticide, do your own expertise and experience as epidemiologists make you optimistic on the possibility of the exposome, or rather pessimistic?
I think I'm both. I think that there's a lot of excitement about the exposome, and I think that we're in the very, very early stages of this sort of idea. And I mean, the concept has been around for a little while, but it's taken some time to get, several projects up and going, particularly in Europe. There are a lot of projects that have been funded on this topic, and I'm excited to learn what those projects will tell us. And I think it's a little early to figure out how we could incorporate that either into risk assessment or also just into our understanding of exposures and health, because many of these things are not persistent. Many of the exposures that people have are not persistent; they're variable, just like pesticides. And so, I am excited that there is a lot of effort going into this. I think that if we don't try, we won't get there. But if we do try, we still may not get there.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree with Laura. I think that this whole approach, like the genome-wide association study, started with a technology trigger. So we are very happy today to have the ability of simultaneously assessing various exposures. This is fantastic. So what we need now is to characterize this exposure more precisely. And the other thing that would be a benefit from endorsing such an approach is the collaboration. That in order to be able to identify, in GWAS studies and in EWAS studies, it's like a Manhattan plot. You're actually looking for associations having very low p-value. So there, in order to do that, you have to bring people together. And this is, whatever the outcome is of the particular research endeavor, this is for good. So I think that it is early to have this translated into something that is tangible. But I think it would benefit us. It would make us better in so many ways.
Okay, thank you, Evangelia, and thank you, Evangelia and Laura, for your talks for this panel. I think that we're coming very close to the end, so maybe I just as a final, as a closing remark, it's not a conclusion, but just something I should have mentioned maybe earlier, is the fact that the Anses, who's hosting this panel, has produced a report, an expertise report, 5 years ago now, in 2016, on occupational exposure to pesticides, and I participated with several experts from various disciplines in that, and it's in line. So if you're if people in the audience are interested in this question and what we know and what we don't know about how to measure exposure to pesticide, you should get to this report. There's a lot of information. So there are a lot of questions that I just don't have time to ask, but I just wanted to thank you again, both of you, for being here. And so
wish we could have been there with you in Paris.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but it's not in Paris. It's in Maison Alfort. It's in the suburbs. So anyway. But yeah, I'm really sorry about that, and hope we will have opportunities to meet for real. And thank you again.
And congratulations.
And goodbye to everybody.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you.